On the afternoon of the 15th of June, 2023, nothing about Monroe Township, Ohio, suggested that horror was about to unfold. It was the kind of quiet community where children played freely and neighbors expected ordinary days to remain ordinary. Inside a modest home just outside Cincinnati, however, a line was crossed that could never be undone. A father picked up a rifle and turned it on his own children. They were not strangers, they were not intruders, they were his sons. Clayton, 7 years old, Hunter, 4, and Chase, just 3. Within minutes, all 3 boys were dead. There was no search, no Amber Alert, no mystery about where the children had gone or who was responsible. When police arrived, the killer was still there, calm, silent, waiting. The man was their father, Chad Dorman. Investigators would later determine that the violence was not accidental or chaotic. Dorman retrieved a .22 caliber rifle from inside the home and carried out the attack deliberately. One of the boys tried to run. He was chased down. Another attempted to hide. It didn't matter. The outcome had already been decided. The children's mother, Laura Dorman, was present. She tried desperately to stop it. At one point, she physically placed herself between the gun and her sons. She was shot in the hand while trying to protect them. Bleeding and terrified, she managed to escape the house and run into the street, screaming for help. A 4-year-old stepdaughter was also inside the home. She fled and alerted neighbors, likely saving her own life. By the time first responders entered the house, it was already too late. The boys were gone. Chad Dorman was found sitting outside, compliant and emotionless. The rifle was recovered. There was no confusion about what had happened. The case exploded across national headlines because of what it represented. A father murdering his own young children is one of the most unsettling crimes imaginable. There was no manifesto, no extremist ideology, no complex conspiracy. Just a parent becoming the most immediate danger to the people he was meant to protect. As investigators began piecing together the days and weeks leading up to the killings, a troubling picture emerged. Family members and defense attorneys claimed Dorman had been struggling with severe mental health issues. Reports described paranoia, emotional instability, and overwhelming stress. Yet there had been no court order removing him from the home, no restraining order, no intervention that clearly predicted the catastrophe to come. Prosecutors filed 3 counts of aggravated murder along with kidnapping charges for restraining the children and assault charges related to shooting their mother. The state initially announced it would seek the death penalty. What followed was a long and closely watched legal process. Dorman first pleaded not guilty, then not guilty by reason of insanity. Psychiatrists evaluated him. Motions were filed. Hearings stretched on for months as the court grappled with one central question: mental illness or intentional evil. In 2024, a plea deal was reached. In exchange for the death penalty being removed from the table, Chad Dorman pleaded guilty to all charges. There would be no trial, no appeals, offering hope of release. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Chad Dorman will die in prison. Outside the courtroom, the community mourned children who never had a chance to grow up. Vigils were held. Baseball teams honored Clayton. Parents hugged their kids tighter, and the same question lingered in the air, as it always does in cases like this. How can something so horrific happen without anyone stopping it in time? This was not ancient history. It happened in 2023 inches, a normal house in a normal neighborhood, and it serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in a child's life is the one society assumes will protect them no matter what. In late December of 2019, while most families were preparing for the holidays, something deeply disturbing was unfolding inside a quiet home in Celebration, Florida. From the outside, the neighborhood looked like a postcard version of suburban America: clean streets, planned communities, and the illusion of safety. Behind one closed door, an entire family was being erased. When authorities finally entered the home in January of 2020, the silence inside was overwhelming. 44-year-old Megan Tott was dead. So were her 3 children: Alec, 13, Tyler, 11, and Zoe, just 4 years old. Even the family dog Breezy had been killed. The person responsible was not an intruder. He was still inside the house. His name was Anthony Tott. Tott did not match the public stereotype of a family annihilator. He was not unemployed or isolated. He ran physical therapy clinics and presented himself as educated, professional, and devoted to his family. To neighbors and acquaintances, The Tots appeared stable, the kind of family that seemed insulated from disaster. That image collapsed instantly once the truth emerged. Law enforcement did not arrive at the Tot home by chance alone. Federal authorities were already investigating Anthony Tot for healthcare fraud tied to his physical therapy businesses. Allegations of fraudulent billing and financial misconduct were closing in. His professional life was unraveling, and the pressure was mounting rapidly. What investigators found inside the home went far beyond financial crime. The bodies had not been there for hours, or even days. Evidence revealed that Megan and the children had been dead for weeks before discovery. During that time, Tot continued living in the house, sleeping, eating, and existing alongside their remains. He had attempted to take his own life as well, but failed. When questioned, Tot did not immediately confess. Instead, he offered a story that would become infamous. He claimed the world was about to end. According to him, society was on the brink of collapse, an undefined apocalypse so severe that death was preferable to survival. In his narrative, killing his family was an act of mercy. Investigators were unconvinced. As they peeled back the layers, the apocalypse story began to crumble. There was no evidence of preparation for a real-world disaster, no stockpiled supplies, no consistent belief system, no external ideology pushing him toward an end-of-days scenario. What did exist were massive debts, failing businesses, and the looming threat of criminal prosecution. The evidence revealed how the killings occurred. Tot poisoned his family with large doses of diphenhydramine, commonly known as Benadryl. But poisoning alone was not the end. Court proceedings would later detail additional violence, suffocation, asphyxiation, and stabbing. This was not a single impulsive act. It was layered, prolonged, and intentional. At different points, Tot attempted to shift blame. He claimed his wife had killed the children and that he had only acted afterward. Forensic evidence dismantled that claim quickly. Megan Tot had been the first to die. The timeline did not support his story. Nothing did. As the case moved toward trial, Tot's defense focused heavily on his mental state. They described a man overwhelmed by stress, delusional, and detached from reality, someone who believed he was sparing his family from something worse. Prosecutors responded with facts. They pointed to planning, to timing, to the weeks he lived with the bodies, to the lies, to the moment when faced with financial ruin and exposure. Tot did not flee, confess, or ask for help. He chose annihilation. In 2022, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. Anthony Tot was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for his wife and 1 for each child, along with a separate count of animal cruelty for killing the family dog. The sentence was absolute. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional penalties tied to the animal cruelty conviction. There would be no future hearing, no chance of release. Anthony Tot will die in prison. The world did not end. There was no apocalypse. Celebration, Florida remained quiet, its streets unchanged. Life continued for everyone except the Tots. Even after conviction, Tot continued framing himself as a protector rather than a destroyer. But the record is clear. When his carefully constructed image collapsed and his lies caught up with him, he did not accept exposure. He erased his family instead. This case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't rage publicly. They wait, they plan, and when they finally act, they leave nothing behind but silence. This story does not begin with fire. It begins with a disappearance, one that poisoned everything that followed. In December of 2009, 8-year-old Susan Powell vanished from her home in West Valley City, Utah. She was a young mother devoted to her 2 sons, Charlie and Braden. Friends would later describe her marriage as controlling and deeply unsettling. The last person to see her alive was her husband, Joshua Powell. Joshua claimed he had taken the boys on a late-night camping trip during a snowstorm. When he returned, he said Susan was gone. Police were immediately suspicious. His behavior was erratic. His explanations shifted. Investigators uncovered signs of marital tension, financial stress, and disturbing journal entries that revealed a man obsessed with control. But there was one devastating problem. There was no body. Without Susan's remains, prosecutors could not file murder charges. And without charges, Joshua Powell remained legally free. As the investigation dragged on, the court attempted a compromise that would later prove catastrophic. Joshua lost custody of his sons. Charlie, 7, and Braden, 5, were placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The boys were safe, loved, and stable. Joshua was granted only supervised visitation, tightly controlled, monitored by the state. On paper, the safeguards appeared sufficient. In reality, they were fragile. On the 5th of February 2012, a state-appointed social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall drove the boys to Joshua's house in Graham, Washington, for a scheduled visit. The visit was supposed to be brief and supervised. Safe. The moment Joshua opened the door, everything changed. He became agitated almost immediately. He ushered the boys inside and slammed the door shut behind them. Griffin Hall tried to follow. It was locked. She pounded on the door. Inside, Joshua refused to respond. Terrified, Griffin Hall ran back to her car and called 911. She told the dispatcher she feared for the children's lives. She said Joshua had locked her out and she couldn't see the boys. Police and firefighters were dispatched immediately. They were already too late. Inside the house, Joshua Powell attacked his sons with a hatchet. After killing them, he ignited gasoline he had poured throughout the home. The resulting explosion rocked the neighborhood. Flames tore through the structure, creating an inferno that first responders could not safely enter. Joshua Powell and both boys died in the fire. Investigators later confirmed the explosion was intentional. Gasoline had been used to accelerate the blaze. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a planned murder-suicide carried out during the narrow window when the system gave him access to the people he wanted most to control. The public reaction was immediate and furious. How could the prime suspect in a woman's disappearance be allowed alone with his children? How could a supervised visit collapse so completely? Why were warnings ignored? As the case was examined in the aftermath, the warning signs became impossible to deny. Joshua Powell had been unraveling for years. Financial stress, isolation, a belief that his children were extensions of himself rather than individuals. In the days leading up to the attack, he left emails and voicemails that read like farewells. In one message, he said he could not live without his sons. That statement was not confusion. It was ownership. The story grew even darker as investigators looked deeper. Joshua's family was not blameless in the broader tragedy. His father, Stephen Powell, had been obsessively fixated on Susan writing explicit journal entries about her that made her deeply uncomfortable. His brother, Michael Powell, would later be identified by police as someone they believed helped Joshua conceal Susan's body after her murder. Susan Powell's remains were never found. West Valley City Police have publicly stated their belief that Joshua Powell murdered his wife. Her case remains officially unsolved only because the man responsible died before he could be charged. In death, Joshua Powell controlled the narrative the same way he had controlled his family and life. There was no trial, no confession, just ashes and unanswered questions. The Powell case remains one of the most devastating examples of systemic failure in modern true crime, experts warned the court. Susan's parents begged for stronger protections. Social workers expressed concern. Procedure moved forward anyway. Charlie and Braden were reduced to case numbers instead of children facing a clear and present danger. And when the system finally realized its mistake, the realization came in fire. This case stands as a haunting reminder that sometimes the warning signs are not subtle at all. They are screaming, and no one listens until it is too late. In April of 2011, a well-to-do family in Nantes, France, appeared to vanish overnight. There were no screams heard by neighbors, no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle. Schools were notified that the children would not be returning. Emails were sent explaining that the family had relocated suddenly under unusual circumstances. The house remained closed and quiet, as if its occupants had simply stepped out of their lives. They hadn't left. They were buried beneath their own home. Under the back terrace of that house, investigators would uncover one of the most disturbing family annihilations in modern European history. The bodies of a mother, 4 children, and the family's 2 dogs were found carefully concealed in shallow graves. The man responsible was not missing. He was already on the move. His name was Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. To those who knew him, Xavier did not fit the image of a monster. He came from an old aristocratic French family. He was articulate, educated, and deeply concerned with appearances. He valued order, structure, and control. To outsiders, he presented himself as a devoted husband and father, navigating financial challenges with dignity. Behind that image, everything was collapsing. By early 2011, Xavier's business ventures had failed. He was drowning in debt. Creditors were closing in. The self-image he had built, successful patriarch provider, respected head of the household, was crumbling. For a man obsessed with status and legacy, failure was not an option. Exposure was intolerable. Instead of facing it, he chose erasure. Over the course of several days in early April, Xavier murdered his entire family. His wife Agnes was 48 years old. Their children were Arthur 21, Thomas 18, Anne 16, and Benoit just 13. Investigators later determined that the victims were drugged with sleeping pills before being shot with a .22 long rifle. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. The killings were controlled, methodical, and deliberate. One detail made the case even colder. Thomas, the oldest son, did not live at home full-time. He was away at school. Xavier called him back under a false pretense, claiming there had been an emergency involving his mother. When Thomas returned home, he was killed too. No one was spared. After the murders, Xavier did not flee in panic. He buried them. Beneath the back terrace of the house, he dug shallow graves. Each body was wrapped carefully. Quicklime was used, a detail that suggested an attempt to manage decomposition and odor. The family's 2 dogs were killed and buried, as well their presence erased alongside the humans they belonged to. Then Xavier cleaned. Blood was removed, beds were dismantled. The house was staged to appear abandoned rather than violent. Subscriptions were canceled, letters were mailed, bills were paid. Emails were sent to friends, relatives, and schools explaining the family's disappearance. In those messages, Xavier claimed something extraordinary. He wrote that he had been recruited by U.S. authorities into a covert government operation. According to him, his family had been placed into witness protection. Their disappearance, he said, was necessary, secret, and permanent. The tone was calm, official, disturbingly convincing. For a short time it worked. But silence has a way of breaking illusions. No one heard from Agnes. None of the children contacted friends. Eventually, relatives contacted police. When investigators searched the house, they initially found nothing conclusive. It felt curated, artificial, empty, but not chaotic. Then they searched the terrace. Under the concrete, they found the graves. 7 bodies. The revelation stunned France. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, surveillance footage filled in what happened next. After burying his family, Xavier traveled south through France. He stayed in hotels, ate at restaurants, withdrew cash, mailed letters to friends, some reflective, some unsettling, thanking people for their support and hinting at a final goodbye. He appeared calm. On the 14th of April, 2011, Xavier was captured on hotel surveillance footage in the town of Roquebrune-sur-Argens near the Mediterranean coast. The next day, his car was found abandoned nearby. Footage showed him walking away toward a wooded mountainous area with a bag slung over his shoulder. That was the last confirmed sighting. No body was ever found, no suicide note recovered, no arrest made. French authorities launched a massive manhunt. International alerts were issued. Tips poured in from across Europe, the United States, South America, even Asia. Every reported sighting reignited the case. Every lead collapsed. In 2019, the world believed it was finally over. A man was arrested in Scotland after arriving from France. For hours, headlines announced that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès had been captured. DNA testing destroyed that hope. It was the wrong man. The case fell back into uncertainty. To this day, investigators remain divided. Some believe Xavier committed suicide shortly after abandoning his car, his body hidden in the wilderness. Others believe he planned his escape as meticulously as he planned the murders. He had cash. He had time. He had severed ties cleanly. And he had nothing left to lose. What makes this case uniquely haunting is not just the violence, it is the intelligence behind it. This was not a man who snapped in a moment of rage. This was a father who planned, executed, concealed, and vanished. Every year that passes leaves one terrifying possibility intact, that a man capable of murdering his entire family, burying them beneath his own home, and calmly walking away might still be alive, still moving through the world unseen. This is the case of a father who didn't just destroy his family, he erased them, and then he erased himself. On the morning of the 10th of April, 2001, a quiet neighborhood in Scottsdale, Arizona, was shattered by an explosion. Flames tore through a single-family home. Windows blew outward. Smoke climbed into the sky. Firefighters arrived expecting a gas accident, the kind of emergency that happens without malice. What they found instead was a family annihilation. Inside the burned home were the bodies of Mary Fisher and her 2 children, Brittany 12 and Bobby 10. All 3 were already dead before the fire began. The explosion was not an accident, It was the final act of a carefully staged crime. The man responsible was not there. His name was Robert William Fisher. From the outside, the Fisher family appeared stable. Robert worked in the medical field as a respiratory therapist and had experience connected to emergency services. Mary was a devoted mother. The family attended church. Their children were active, social, and well-liked. To neighbors, there were no obvious signs that violence was brewing. Behind closed doors, however, the marriage was unraveling. Friends later described Robert Fisher as controlling and volatile. Arguments were frequent. Police had been called to the home before due to domestic disputes. Mary had confided to others that she was considering divorce, a word that carried enormous weight for a man obsessed with control, authority, and image. To Robert Fisher, abandonment was not an option. Investigators believe that sometime during the night, Fisher murdered his family while they slept. Mary was shot in the back of the head. The children were not shot. Instead, their throats were cut, a far more intimate and brutal method that shocked even seasoned detectives. This was not random violence. It was personal, deliberate. After killing his family, Fisher turned the house itself into a weapon. Rather than simply setting a fire, investigators believe he pulled a gas line inside the home, allowing gas to accumulate overnight. In the early morning hours, the house ignited, causing a powerful explosion designed to destroy evidence and buy time. It worked temporarily. Fire can erase much, but it cannot erase everything. Autopsies confirmed the family was dead before the explosion. The fire was not the cause of death. It was a distraction. And it gave Robert Fisher the head start he needed. For more than a week after the explosion, Fisher vanished without a trace. Then, 10 days later, investigators made a critical discovery. Mary Fisher's Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned near the small town of Young, Arizona, deep in rugged terrain bordering the Tonto National Forest. Nearby, the family dog Blue was found alive. Robert Fisher was not. The location raised immediate alarm. The area around Young is unforgiving, dense forest, rocky canyons, and miles of wilderness where trails disappear and searches collapse into nothing. For most people, entering that landscape unprepared would be a death sentence. For Robert Fisher, it was familiar ground. He was an experienced outdoorsman, a hunter, a survivalist. He knew how to live off the land. He knew how to disappear. Search teams flooded the area. Helicopters scanned from above. Tracking dogs followed scent trails that simply stopped. Nothing was found. At first, many believed Fisher had taken his own life in the wilderness and that nature had claimed him. But as days turned into months and months into years, doubt crept in. There were no remains, no weapon, no confirmation of death. Investigators began considering a more disturbing possibility. Robert Fisher may have escaped. Evidence suggested preparation. He had access to firearm survival gear and knowledge of remote routes. He may have had connections that allowed him to blend into communities where questions were not asked. The explosion wasn't just rage, it was misdirection. In 2002, the FBI placed Robert William Fisher on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His face appeared on billboards in post offices and across television screens nationwide. He was described as armed, dangerous, and extremely disciplined. Tips poured in from everywhere: Mexico, Canada, rural towns where men lived off-grid. Each report sparked hope. Each one fell apart. Years passed. In 2021, the FBI removed Fisher from the 10 most wanted list, not because he was found, not because the case was solved, but because the list prioritizes fugitives where renewed publicity can generate leads, and Fisher's case had already received decades of saturation. The warrant remains active. Robert William Fisher is still wanted. Born on the 13th of April, 1961, he would now be in his 60s. Older, possibly heavier, possibly gray. Investigators believe he could still be alive, living under a false identity, blending into a world where no one knows what he left behind. What haunts this case is not only the brutality of the crime, but the possibility that it worked. That a man murdered his wife and children, turned his home into a crime scene, used the wilderness as a shield, and succeeded in vanishing. No trial, no confession, no grave. More than 20 years later, one question refuses to disappear. Did Robert William Fisher die in the forest, or did he get away with it? On the night of the 1st of March, 1976, a man walked out of his office at the U.S. State Department, drove home to Bethesda, Maryland, and decided that his life as he knew it was over. By morning, 5 people would be dead, and the man responsible would vanish so completely that nearly half a century later, no one can say with certainty where he went or whether he ever faced justice. His name was William Bradford Bishop Jr. Bishop was not an ordinary suspect. He was a highly educated diplomat, fluent in multiple languages, polished, articulate, and trusted with sensitive government information. He understood systems, borders, and how authority operates. Those traits made him successful in his career and uniquely dangerous when everything began to collapse. Earlier that day, Bishop learned he had been passed over for a promotion he desperately wanted. His career had stalled for years, and supervisors described him as arrogant, entitled, and convinced he was more capable than those above him. Being denied advancement was not merely disappointing. To Bishop, it was humiliation. That same day, he withdrew cash and went shopping. Investigators later determined he purchased a hammer, a gas can, a shovel, and a pitchfork. These were not impulsive purchases. They were preparations. That night, inside the family home, Bishop murdered his entire household. His wife, Annette, his mother, Lillian, and his 3 sons, William Jr., 14, Brenton, 10, and Jeffrey, just 5 years old. The killings were brutal and personal. Authorities concluded that Bishop used a hammer to beat them to death one by one. But he wasn't finished. After the murders, Bishop loaded the bodies into his station wagon and drove south more than 300 miles, calmly and deliberately. In a remote, wooded area near Columbia, North Carolina, he dug a shallow pit. He placed the bodies inside, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. Forest rangers later reported seeing smoke rising from the area. When they investigated, they found burned human remains. At that moment, authorities still didn't know who the victims were. The bodies were discovered before the crime scene. Days later, neighbors in Bethesda grew concerned about the family's sudden absence. When police entered the house on March 10, they found bloodstains and signs of extreme violence. William Bradford Bishop Jr. was nowhere to be found. The investigation quickly focused on him as the only suspect. His career setback, his shopping trip, his sudden disappearance, everything aligned. Then came another discovery. Bishop's station wagon was found abandoned not in North Carolina but in Tennessee, deep within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park near Elkmont. Blood evidence was found in and around the vehicle. The location suggested something chilling. North Carolina was where he disposed of the bodies. Tennessee was where he disappeared. With his education, language skills, and international experience, investigators believed Bishop had everything he needed to vanish. He had lived abroad. He understood how to cross borders, how to blend in, how to become invisible. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. Wanted posters spread across the country. International alerts were issued. Sightings poured in Italy, France, Switzerland, South America. Small towns reported elderly men who spoke multiple languages and lived quietly, keeping to themselves. Every lead sparked hope. Every lead collapsed. Unlike many fugitives, investigators never believed Bishop committed suicide. There was no evidence pointing to it. No body, no weapon, no farewell. Everything about his actions suggested he intended to live, just not as William Bradford Bishop Jr. In 2018, the FBI removed Bishop from its 10 most wanted fugitives list, not because he was found, not because the case was closed, but because the list prioritizes fugitives where publicity can generate new leads and Bishop's case had already received decades of exposure. The warrant remains active. Born in 1936, Bishop would now be in his late 80s, and that fact makes the case even more disturbing. He didn't flee in panic. He didn't unravel emotionally. He executed a plan. He prepared. He killed. He transported bodies. He destroyed evidence. He staged a second disappearance point. 5 lives were erased in a single night because one man could not tolerate professional failure. This case stands as a chilling example of how intelligence, when stripped of empathy, can become a weapon. A father used his education and discipline not to protect his family, but to annihilate them and escape accountability. And the question that refuses to fade remains brutally simple. What if William Bradford Bishop Jr. didn't just disappear, but lived out the rest of his life knowing he got away with it? Christian Longo cared deeply about how he looked to the world. Young, clean-cut, confident, the kind of man who could shake your hand, smile easily, and convince you he had everything under control. He spoke about responsibility like it was a personal creed, a husband, a father of 3. A man who wanted others to believe he was solid, capable, and respectable. In December of 2001, that image collapsed, and 4 people paid with their lives. The man at the center of it all was Christian Longo. By the winter of 2001, Longo's life was quietly unraveling. He was drowning in debt, bills were piling up, jobs were lost, lies were stacking on top of lies to employers, to friends, to family. Inside his marriage, those lies were detonating everything. His wife Mary Jane Longo was in her mid-30s. She had been carrying the weight of the household while Christian played the role of provider. Their relationship was strained, unstable, and cracking. Divorce was no longer hypothetical. It was looming. For Christian Longo, divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was exposure. Once a marriage ends, questions follow about money, about work, about why the lifestyle never matched the income. And for a man, obsessed with image exposure was intolerable. Sometime in December 2001, Longo made a decision that would place him among the most infamous fathers in modern American true crime. His children were still so young. Zachary was 5, Sadie was 3, Madison was just 2. These were not teenagers who challenged his authority. These were toddlers' children who trusted him completely. He killed them anyway. Autopsy reports later revealed different causes of death. Zachary and Sadie were suffocated. Mary Jane and Madison were strangled. The variation mattered. This was not a single moment of panic. It was sustained, personal, intentional. What came next made the crime feel even colder. Longo didn't dump the bodies in desperation. He packaged them. He used suitcases. Mary Jane and Madison were placed inside luggage and weighted down before being thrown into coastal waters, treated like items to be transported and discarded. As days passed, the ocean began returning pieces of the truth. Zachary's body was recovered first on the 19th of December, 2001. That discovery transformed a missing family case into something far darker. On December 22, Sadie was found. And on December 27, the bodies of Mary Jane and Madison were recovered in Yaquina Bay, near Newport, Oregon. By then, Christian Longo was already gone. While Oregon was discovering his family one by one, Longo was running, trying to turn distance into innocence. And here's what separated him from impulsive fugitives. He didn't run like a man afraid. He ran like a man who believed his lie would work. Longo fled the country to Mexico and adopted a new identity, calling himself Michael Finley, a freelance journalist. He didn't hide in isolation. He socialized. He blended in. He lived openly convinced he was smarter than the truth chasing him. Back in the United States, investigators moved fast. Christian Longo became the target of an international manhunt. His face spread across news broadcasts. That kind of attention doesn't fade quietly. It worked. On the 13th of January 2002, Longo was recognized in Mexico and arrested near Tulum. There was no dramatic shootout, no final stand, just the collapse of a carefully constructed lie. He was extradited back to the United States. In court, the mask returned. Longo didn't simply deny responsibility, he redirected it. He claimed his wife had killed 2 of the children and injured the 3rd, and that he had only acted afterward in rage. It was a story crafted for sympathy. Prosecutors dismantled it piece by piece. The forensic evidence didn't match. The timeline didn't match. The method of disposal didn't match. You don't accidentally place bodies into suitcases and dump them methodically in the ocean. You don't panic your way into a new identity in another country. The jury saw what he was. Christian Longo was convicted of murdering his wife and children and sentenced to death. Years later, another twist followed. In 2022, Oregon's governor commuted all death row sentences in the state. Longo's sentence became life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be executed, but he will never be released. Christian Longo will spend the rest of his life aging in a cell long enough to sit with the fact that the one thing he tried to protect, his image, is permanently destroyed. This case is not just about violence. It's about a man who believed he could zip his family out of existence, change his name, and step into a new life. And learned too late that some crimes don't sink. They resurface. For 2 days, a young mother and her infant daughter lay dead inside a quiet townhouse in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. No screams were heard, no neighbors called police. Nothing about the house suggested violence from the outside. And the man who should have been there was already thousands of miles away. On the 20th of January 2006, 2 7-year-old Rachel Entwistle and her 9-month-old daughter Lillian Rose were shot and killed inside their home. Their bodies would not be discovered until January 22, after a second welfare check finally revealed what the first had missed. By then, Rachel's husband and Lillian's father was gone. His name was Neil Entwistle. To friends and family, the Entwistles appeared to be a young couple trying to build a life. Neil was British, Rachel was American. They had recently moved from England to Massachusetts, so Rachel could be closer to her parents. On the surface, it looked like a fresh start. Behind that image, everything was unraveling. Neil Entwistle was unemployed. His business ventures had failed. Credit card debt was mounting. Financial problems followed him from the UK to the United States. Rachel had begun confiding in others that the marriage was struggling. Divorce was being discussed. For Neil, divorce wasn't just the end of a relationship. It meant exposure. Sometime on January 20, Rachel and Lillian were shot while lying together in the master bedroom. Bedding had been placed over their bodies, partially concealing them from view. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of a stranger inside the home. The weapon was a .22 caliber Colt revolver connected to Rachel's father's gun collection. The caliber mattered. A .22 doesn't always announce itself loudly. It's quiet, controlled, intentional. One bullet passed through Rachel and into her infant daughter. After the killings, Neil Entwistle did not call for help. He did not attempt CPR. He did not alert Rachel's parents, who lived nearby. Instead, he left. Early on January 21, around 5:00 a.m., Entwistle purchased a one-way ticket out of the United States. He went to Logan Airport in Boston and boarded a flight to London using his British passport. By the time Rachel's family grew concerned and contacted police, Neil was already airborne. The first welfare check failed. Officers entered the townhouse but did not notice the bodies. The bedroom appeared undisturbed at a glance. Nothing immediately screamed violence. It wasn't until a second check, 2 days later, that police fully searched the master bedroom and made the horrific discovery. Once the bodies were found, the investigation moved quickly. Entwistle's absence stood out immediately. So did his sudden international flight. Investigators began reconstructing his movements, and then the digital trail emerged. Prosecutors would later reveal that before the murders, Neil Entwistle had searched the internet for information related to killing and violent acts. These were not searches made after the fact. They showed preparation, intent. In February 2006, Entwistle was located in England. He wasn't hiding in isolation. He was arrested by London police on the Underground near Royal Oak Station like any other commuter and extradited back to the United States to face trial. In court, Entwistle claimed innocence. He told investigators there had been an intruder, that he came home to find Rachel and Lillian already dead, that he panicked and fled because he knew he would be blamed. It was a story built around fear. The evidence told a different story. There was no sign of forced entry. Gunshot residue was found on Entwistle's clothing. His fingerprints were connected to the firearm. The internet searches showed forethought. And his behavior afterward, buying a one-way ticket and leaving the country, immediately spoke louder than anything he said later. Prosecutors argued that Neil Entwistle killed his wife and child because his life was collapsing. No job, no money, no way to maintain the image he had sold to Rachel and her family. Divorce would have exposed everything. So instead of being left, he eliminated the problem. The defense attempted to introduce doubt, questioning forensic handling, suggesting procedural errors, and floating the idea of an unknown intruder without ever identifying one. The jury wasn't convinced. In 2008, Neil Entwistle was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Rachel and Lillian. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be released. Even after conviction, Entwistle continued to claim innocence. Appeals were filed. Each one failed. The evidence remained overwhelming. The verdict stood. Rachel never got the chance to leave a marriage she was questioning. Lillian never got the chance to take her first steps. Their lives ended quietly under blankets in a bedroom meant to be safe. This case is a reminder that running doesn't erase evidence, it only sharpens suspicion. Crossing an ocean didn't make Neil Entwistle innocent. It made the truth easier to see. On the 9th of November, 1971, in the quiet town of Westfield, New Jersey, a father carried out one of the most calculated family murders in American history. Then he locked the door behind him and walked away. For nearly a month, no one noticed. Inside a large Victorian home, 5 bodies lay decomposing while the man who killed them calmly stepped into a new life. This was not a crime driven by sudden rage or panic. It was a crime built on belief, discipline, and chilling patience. The man responsible was John List. To outsiders, John List was unremarkable. He worked as an accountant, he attended church faithfully, he was quiet, reserved, almost invisible. But inside his home, pressure had been building for years. By 1971, List's life was collapsing. He had lost his job, his finances were in ruins, mortgage payments were overdue. Yet he refused to downsize from the family's massive home, clinging to the appearance of success he believed was his duty to maintain. Worse still, in his mind, his family was failing him spiritually. List was deeply religious and rigid in his beliefs. He valued obedience, hierarchy, and moral authority. He believed his role as a father was not only to provide, but to enforce spiritual discipline. Over time, he became convinced that his wife and children were drifting away from the values he believed would save their souls. To John List, this wasn't normal family conflict. It was moral decay. And in his worldview, moral failure was worse than death. On the morning of November 9, List began carrying out his plan. He started with his wife Helen. She was drinking coffee in the kitchen when he shot her in the back of the head. There was no argument, no confrontation, just execution. He used firearms he owned legally, a 9mm pistol and a .22 caliber revolver weapons he was familiar with and comfortable using. Later that day, his mother Alma returned to her attic apartment in the house. She was 84 years old. List followed her upstairs and shot her as well. Then he waited. That afternoon, his children came home from school one by one. His daughter Patricia, 16, arrived first. He shot her in the back of the head. Her body would later be moved to the ballroom. His youngest son, Frederick, 13, arrived next and was killed the same way. But List was still not finished. His oldest son, John Jr., 15, was away at soccer practice. Instead of fleeing or continuing immediately, List did something that revealed just how controlled he was. He left the house and went to watch his son play. He sat on the sidelines. He cheered. He behaved like a normal father. Then he brought John Jr. home and killed him. 5 members of his family were dead before dinner. Afterward, List began staging the scene. He laid the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the ballroom, positioning them carefully. He believed he was preparing them for the afterlife. He lowered the thermostat to slow decomposition. He turned on a radio and tuned it to a religious station, allowing sermons and hymns to play continuously. He removed his own image from family photographs throughout the house, a symbolic erasure of himself from the family he had just destroyed. List also created cover stories. Letters were sent to the children's schools explaining absences. Notes were written to delay suspicion. Everything was designed to buy time. Then John List walked out the front door. For nearly a month, neighbors assumed the family was traveling. Mail piled up. The house remained closed. On December 7, police finally entered the home after concerns grew too large to ignore. What they found was horrifying. 5 decomposing bodies, arranged inside the ballroom, and a handwritten confession letter. In it, John List calmly explained his reasoning. He wrote that he believed he had saved his family from moral corruption. That death was preferable to eternal damnation. There was no apology, no remorse, only justification. John List was already gone. For nearly 18 years, he lived undetected. He changed his name to Robert Peter Clark. He moved across the country. He remarried. He joined another church. He returned to accounting. He became a quiet, dependable man once again. No one suspected a thing. He blended into society, perfectly proof that sometimes the most dangerous killers are not the ones who flee in chaos, but the ones who disappear into routine. His freedom lasted until 1989, when America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the case. A forensic artist named Frank Bender created an age-progressed clay bust showing what John List might look like decades later. The resemblance was uncanny. Someone who knew Robert Clark saw the broadcast and recognized him. On the 1st of June 1989, John List was arrested at an accounting office in Midlothian, Virginia. He did not resist. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The confession letter ballistics, the timeline, and the life he rebuilt under a false name. In 1990, John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would never be released. John List died behind bars in 2008. This case remains one of the most unsettling examples of calculated family annihilation, not because of rage, not because of chaos, but but because of how ordinary it looked from the outside and how long it worked. John List didn't run from justice. He lived quietly beside it. More than 50 years later, the argument still hasn't ended. Some believe he is one of the most cold-blooded family killers in American history. Others insist he is the victim of a broken justice system that needed someone to blame. What makes this case endure is not just the violence, it's the uncertainty. On the early morning of the 17th of February, 1970, military police responded to a frantic emergency call at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Inside a modest home, they found a scene of extreme violence. Colette McDonald was dead. She was 26 years old and pregnant. Her daughters were also dead, Kimberly 5 and Kristen just 2. One person was still alive. His name was Jeffrey McDonald. McDonald was an Army captain and a physician assigned to the Green Berets. He was intelligent, articulate, and trained to remain calm under pressure. When authorities arrived, he was injured but conscious, and he immediately told them what he claimed had happened. According to McDonald, he had fallen asleep on the couch and was awakened by intruders. He described 3 men and 1 woman. He said the woman wore a floppy hat and boots, carried a candle, and chanted phrases like, "Acid is groovy and kill the pigs." He claimed he fought the attackers, was stabbed and beaten unconscious, and woke to find his family dead. The story landed in a very specific moment in American history. This was the height of the Vietnam War. The counterculture movement dominated headlines. The Manson murders were still fresh in the public consciousness. To some, the idea of drug-fueled intruders attacking a military family didn't sound impossible. But investigators inside the house immediately began noticing problems. The crime scene didn't match McDonald's account. The violence appeared to have occurred in stages, not in a chaotic group assault. Blood patterns suggested movement from room to room. Fibers from McDonald's pajama top were found beneath his wife's body and under his daughter's, suggesting the garment was torn during the killings, not during a separate struggle. In the master bedroom, the word pig was written in blood on the headboard. To many investigators, it looked staged, as if someone was forcing the scene to resemble a cult-style attack. Weapons recovered from the home included a knife, an ice pick, and a wooden club. None of them clearly supported the presence of unknown attackers. McDonald's injuries also raised questions. He had wounds, but many were superficial. The level of violence inflicted on Colette and the children was far greater. The Army conducted the first investigation. Later in 1970, charges were dismissed after a military hearing, and McDonald was honorably discharged. To supporters, it looked like vindication. He moved to California and resumed life as a civilian physician. But the case didn't disappear. Civilian investigators continued reviewing the evidence. Forensic interpretations were revisited. Witness statements were re-examined. The inconsistencies remained. In 1975, 5 years after the murders, a federal grand jury indicted Jeffrey McDonald on 3 counts of murder. The delay itself became controversial. Supporters argued that time had corrupted evidence. Critics argued that the government had taken years because accusing an Army officer of killing his family demanded absolute certainty. The trial finally began in 1979. Prosecutors argued that McDonald murdered his family after an argument with his wife and then staged the crime scene to resemble a cult-style home invasion. They focused on forensic evidence, blood patterns, fiber transfer, and the lack of credible proof that intruders had ever been there. The defense countered with claims of tunnel vision and investigative bias. They argued that authorities locked onto McDonald early and built the case backward. They pointed to alleged sightings of a woman matching the floppy hat description and framed McDonald as a man destroyed by a justice system desperate to correct its earlier mistake. The jury deliberated. In the end, they found McDonald guilty. He was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. For most cases, that would have been the end. For this one, it was only the beginning. Jeffrey McDonald never changed his story. He has continued to insist that intruders killed his family. Over the decades, he filed appeal after appeal. Lawyers, journalists, and former investigators took sides. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Entire careers were built arguing both his guilt and his innocence. Some believe the evidence against him is overwhelming: a staged scene, inconsistent injuries, forensic contradictions, and no credible proof that intruders ever existed. Others believe the case was poisoned by early investigative errors and confirmation bias, that once authorities decided McDonald was guilty, every piece of evidence was interpreted to fit that conclusion. Even today, there's no universal agreement. McDonald remains in federal prison. He has aged behind bars. He has never confessed. He has never recanted his story. To his supporters, that consistency is proof of innocence. To his critics, it is proof of discipline and control. That is why this case refuses to fade. It isn't just about evidence. It's about belief. Can a respected army doctor murder his pregnant wife and 2 daughters, then calmly explain it away? Or can a justice system lock onto the wrong narrative and destroy someone beyond recovery? Jeffrey McDonald didn't just leave behind a crime scene. He left behind a question that refuses to die. These stories do not belong to the past. They don't fade with time, nor do they soften with distance. Across decades, countries, and cultures, the pattern repeats itself with chilling consistency. These were not strangers hiding in the dark. They were fathers, husbands, providers, men entrusted with protection, guidance, and love. And yet, when control slipped from their hands, they chose annihilation over accountability. Each case in this series reveals the same underlying fracture. The violence did not come from nowhere. It grew quietly through financial pressure, wounded pride, obsession with image, fear of exposure, and a belief that authority over family meant ownership. When reality challenged that belief, the response was not surrender. It was erasure. What makes these cases so disturbing is not just the brutality, but the intimacy. These crimes happened in bedrooms, kitchens, living rooms, places meant to be safe. The victims did not run from danger. They lived with it, trusted it, depended on it. Some of these men vanished into forests across borders into new identities. Others sat in courtrooms and listened as life sentences were read aloud. But none of that restores what was taken. No explanation, diagnosis, or debate can undo the moment a parent decides their family does not deserve to survive their failure. And that is the truth these stories leave behind. Family annihilation rarely announces itself with warnings loud enough to stop it in time. It hides behind normal routines, closed doors, and carefully maintained appearances. By the time the signs are understood, the damage is already permanent. These cases are not meant to shock for shock's sake. They are reminders, uncomfortable ones, that power without empathy is dangerous, and control without accountability can become lethal. Because sometimes the greatest threat to a family is not the world outside. It's the person everyone trusted most inside.